This is the overview of Chapter 5, Part 1. The title of this chapter is Getting Started Reviewing the Literature. Now, I'm assuming that you folks have already taken a look at the different three parts showing how to do a literature search with an example of finding one single research article that was relevant by going to the library website. If you haven't watched those videos, make sure that you do. I wanted to start out with that example, with the sort of, walking you through the steps of finding an actual relevant study to make more concrete what this chapter talks about and what these PowerPoint notes summarize, because a lot of this stuff is quite abstract and is easier to grasp if you have concrete examples in mind. So, because I was able to walk you through a concrete example and introduce some of the ideas there, I'm not going to have to cover every one of the PowerPoint notes here that are listed. There's quite a few slides, and it's not necessary to go through all of it. Some of it gets kind of repetitive. So I'm just going to hit the basic stuff in this chapter, and then certainly you can go through everything to get a more detailed understanding of the main points from this chapter. So, as I mentioned in previous videos, that at the very start of a research project, you have to ask yourself, what is it that I'm interested in learning more about? Not only myself, but other people who might be interested in the topic. What specifically do I want to learn? That's my research question. You have to identify your research question that is then going to guide the rest of your study. That's step number one. The next step in any research project is to search the existing literature and to write a literature review. So after you decide what you're interested in, you've got to do a search of studies that are relevant, that have touched upon the same issue previously, so you can learn what's already known, what's already been done in the area, so that you can come up with a study that offers something new. That's not just a rehash of what's done before, and that shows that you understand and respect other people's work that's been done previous to yours. So after you decide this research question, you need to go out and find out, okay, what do we already know? And the way you do that is by searching for studies that are relevant, that have touched on this same issue before. This chapter will advise students on how to go about searching the literature and engaging critically with the ideas of other writers. It will also help you to understand some of the expectations of the literature review and give you some ideas about how to assess the quality of existing research. Okay, so to shorten that down, what we cover in this chapter is how to put together a literature review. It's normally a section of your paper. Toward the beginning, you usually have an introduction at the beginning of your study. When you're writing up your study, you have an introduction that introduces the topic and usually also stresses the importance of the topic and the relevance of the topic. But the next thing that you often see in a study will be the literature review section, where you summarize what we already know from the research, from the area. So that's what they are talking about when they say literature review, is they're talking about a section of your paper that summarizes studies so that we can have an overall sense of what we already know in this area. Searching the literature should answer these questions. What is already known about this area? I've stressed that. What concepts and theories are relevant? So, what ideas, concepts, theories have researchers who looked at this question before? What theories have they developed? What ideas have they developed? How do they conceptualize these ideas? With the example that I showed with the library search, the question that I wanted to answer was, what is the relationship between low self-control, or another term for that, impulsivity? What's the relationship between impulsivity and acting violently? So I wanted to see what studies have to say about that already. Now, as I search through all the studies, I'm going to learn, oh, they've come up with some theories. There's actually a theory that's called self-control theory. Well, what does that say? So you learn that by reading papers that have been done already. And important concepts. What do you mean when you say low self-control? What exactly do we mean by that? How do you measure that? How have researchers in the past measured that so that I know how to measure it in my own study? Next question, what research methods and strategies have been used in this area? So again, what sort of methods do they typically use? Do they use surveys? Do they use experiments? Do they use interviews? How do they do it? How's it been done in the past? Even if you decide you want to do it differently, you still need to know what's been done in the past and be able to decide based on your own understanding sort of what was wrong with what was done in the past and how you can improve it and maybe do it a little bit better. Are there any controversies? It's one thing that makes a paper interesting is if you sort of take on something that where there's a lot of disagreement, and if you can weigh in on that, it is something that it's not necessarily scientifically important, but it's something that people are going to take an interest in if you pursue a topic that people disagree over, right? Also, are there any inconsistencies in the findings? So did you find all the studies that have looked at impulsivity and violent behavior? Do they all find a connection between the two, that more impulsive people are more violent? Or do some studies find that they're not connected, or other studies maybe find that impulsive people are less violent? So, is there inconsistencies, and why? Try to, as you're reading through all of these studies, trying to learn the literature, if they're inconsistent, well, is there some reason that you can figure out why they're inconsistent? Are the studies that don't find any connection, are they too small? The sample sizes are too small, and you don't have powerful enough statistical methods to be able to detect patterns? What's going on? So inconsistencies is something to look for, and also maybe the most important, after you wade through these other questions, is, well, what do we still not know? What are the gaps in our knowledge? Are there certain things we don't know that would be interesting to find out? If you can come up with that, what the gap is, there's your paper right there to make it interesting, to contribute something new. A literature review can be several things. You can use it for different, the point here, and I don't think it's a particularly important one, but the point, this term literature review can be used kind of in different ways. It can be used as a list of relevant theories, the actual searching that you go out and do, the writing where you're trying, when they say survey of writing, that just means you're kind of trying to cover in your literature review in the section of the paper that you're writing up. Say it's like 2 pages long or something. You're trying to briefly cover all of the writing that's been done out there in this area, and so they call it a survey when you're doing an overview. It can be, it's a literature review is a way of learning about the subject. As you're trying to track down and read these articles that are relevant, you're learning about all this stuff. It's also it's help in finding dissertation topics and research methods. So again, it helps you. You can say, my literature review, that's my search where I'm trying to find an interesting topic to do. And of course, it's going to be an important component of any paper that you report, or say you do a thesis as a graduate student or dissertation, a big paper, right, a big project. The literature review is going to be a very important part of that. Especially since you're new to the area, and if you're a student, it's like your first time doing it, then you really need to have a nice long literature review section to show that you know what you're talking about, right? That you've learned all of the material. Okay, so you write a literature review because you need to know we need to find out what's already known about the research area. We can learn from weaknesses in other people's studies, mistakes they've made, improvements that could be made over and beyond past studies. You can learn about different theoretical and methodological approaches and sort of decide what's best for you. It may help you develop an analytical framework. And what they mean by that is that's sort of like, what theory are you going to try to test? What explanation, claim, hypothesis between impulsivity, for example, and violent behavior? What's your theory going to be? That's what they mean by analytical framework, is what's your approach? How are you coming at this from? It may lead you to consider including variables in research, which you might not have thought. So, we don't get too much into the sort of statistical analysis in this course, but if you have taken statistics, you should have learned that in really sophisticated, serious research, we look not just at, let's stick with this example, we look not at just impulsivity and the relationship between it and violent behavior, but we also look at other factors, other independent variables that might influence violent behavior, and that we need to take those into account. We need to look at those at the same time we're looking at impulsivity, because maybe it's not really impulsivity that's causing violent behavior. Maybe it's other things like, for example, gender. We know that guys tend to be significantly more violent than women, a statistical tendency. So we probably want to look at the gender factor because we know it's important. We might want to look at age, for example, because we know that younger people tend to have higher rates of violence than a lot older people. So you might want to look at age too. So you look at several factors to see if, once you've looked at those other factors and taken those into account, does impulsivity still seem to have an impact on violent behavior? So your literature review, as you go through all these studies, you can see other important variables that have popped up, other important factors that seem to be connected to violence. And especially if you're doing quantitative research with, using statistical methods, you'll want to look at several factors at the same time, not just impulsivity, with following our example here. So, of course, as you do your literature review, it may suggest further research questions. We've covered that. And it's also it's something you need to have in your paper. You've got to talk about what's already been found in the past. If you don't, that's just breaking the rules. As I mentioned in the earlier videos, that the way the scientific method works is it's a collaborative, it's a community effort. And you just don't suddenly walk into that and say, well, I know everything there is to know about violent behavior, and so I don't have to quote anybody else, cite anybody else, read anybody else. If you do that, you're acting like their work's not serious and it's not worth looking at and not worth respecting and talking about. That's not the way it works. So it's one part of it, it's this form of respect, but it's also the proper way to do it, because you need to, the scientific method works on accumulation of knowledge. It builds on what we already know step by step. So that's the way it works. So it needs to be done that way. Let's see. Well, this is just something from the textbook. We can skip this. This is getting kind of concrete. You can certainly look at this on your own, but I'll skip this for now. So when you're going through all of these studies and finding relevant studies one at a time, you read through them and find out you want to do things that's in the list here. Take lots of notes, and when they say including references, one good thing about when you find a good paper is that that paper has a literature review, and they've gone over maybe not every relevant study, but they go over at least some relevant studies. And so you want to make a note of those and say, oh, I see that you got Jones and colleagues did this paper in 2015, and that was about impulsivity and violent behavior. So I need to go look up that one too, because that's relevant. So you need to take note of the studies that they found and build on those and go find those and read through those and then use those studies, right? And so you want to be not only trying to understand what the paper you're reading is all about and what their conclusions are, but you want to get these other things as well that will help you with your own study. So you want to dig for what's a good research question specifically for my study. As you read through these other studies, well, where's the gap? What hasn't been done yet? Okay, there's an idea. I'm not seeing this. I've read 10 studies and nobody ever talks about this. Maybe I can turn that into my own project, my own study. Identify sources you will want to return to later. So that, again, you use these studies to help you make progress on your own nuts and bolts, the details of how you're going to do your own study. And then be selective. You saw that when we did that library search, that if you put in the keywords self-control and violent, like we did, you get hundreds of thousands of papers. You can't handle that. That's way too much. You're only going to be able to handle a stack of papers. And so you have to find those that are truly relevant, truly scholarly. Pick the ones that are truly scholarly. Pick the ones that look like they're, maybe another time I can show you a technique, but let me just describe it right now. I'll use Google Scholar quite a bit, which is free. It's not connected to the university. It's free. And go to Google Scholar, and if you type in, do the same search we did with self-control and violent behavior, it'll bring up tens of thousands of studies too, just like our library search did. But one advantage of Google Scholar is it'll tell you, one of the things it'll tell you is how many other people have quoted that paper in the past or cited that paper, have used that paper in their own literature review, in their own papers. Because, if you see a really widely cited paper, famous study, it'll be cited by 1,000 people or 2,000 people or 5,000 people. So that study is especially relevant and one that you probably ought to pay attention to and see what they're saying. And you probably ought to cite it in your own paper because everybody else is. So it must have something to it. You need to at least take a look at it. So the library database won't tell you that, but if you do Google Scholar, it will tell you how many times that paper has ever been in its existence, has ever been cited by other researchers. And it can be all the way from nothing up to thousands of times. And the bigger the number, the more, let's call it quote unquote, the more important the paper. And so you get up to 50, 100, 150, 200, that's getting to be a pretty serious paper. You get more than that, then even more serious. So that's a little trick right there. So it's kind of a measure of importance. And you want to be selective and focus on the most important research. And of course, the research that's relevant, that's dealing with what you're dealing with. With my example, the impulsivity and violent behavior. Okay, read books and articles. So I showed you an example of finding a scholarly peer-reviewed article, but books are usually acceptable as sources. They're a little bit harder though because they're obviously big, and so you have to sift through those and find those one or two or three little tidbits from a big book and then cite those for your paper. So books are a little bit more work and a little bit more difficult in a certain way, but they have more stuff too, so they can be helpful, and they're usually considered to be fairly scholarly. So we already talked about keeping notes. You also want to pay attention to keywords because usually research papers will list keywords to kind of help people know what the paper's about. And so you would if you see keywords that say self-control, violent behavior, okay, this paper sounds like it's probably relevant. But maybe you didn't think about impulsivity before, but you see that the paper that you're looking at also has the term impulsivity. You go, oh, okay, well that's kind of a synonym for low self-control. So I'll have to remember that keyword too. I can use that in the future. It might help me, right? So pay attention to the keywords. Of course, you can come up with your own keywords. Let's see. We're getting pretty long in this video, so let's stop right there.